And now our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Oliver Philpot. Ollie, CEO of the Central Coast Tourism. So he's going to tell you a little bit about, hopefully, what we can expect.
Well, good evening. Having tracked this project for just over a year since I've been involved on the Central Coast, it would appear to me that on the basis of the information that's been presented to you tonight, the various other public forums that have taken place, the factual information that is in the community forum, notwithstanding the findings of the tribunal that was held last year, that the environmental case for this project is largely made. But for many of you, that may not be enough. Of course, there's also the economic impacts and the social implications of a project of this magnitude that need to be taken into account, and that's what I intend to spend some time talking about tonight. Specifically the economic impacts, which I think are largely assumed but not necessarily understood. So I thought I'd go into some detail about the projections that we have for this site for the tourism industry, and then spend some time talking about the social impacts, which I think are equally important. We've had some conversation about that tonight. But there is, in my view, something that we need to turn our attention to very quickly on the basis that the Adelaide is scuttled. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Bill spoke earlier tonight about the need to use evidence to inform our decisions, and that's certainly our approach at Central Coast Tourism. And the data that I'm going to speak to you about tonight in detail is evidence-based, it's science-based, and I wouldn't present it to you unless I was confident in the methodology that was employed to reach these conclusions. We're very fortunate to have evidence of the experience of other dive sites across Australia. And early last year, a very instructional report was released by Vicky Schaefer and Meredith Lawley from the University of Sunshine Coast. And they explored the economic impacts associated with the exHMAS Brisbane, scuttled off the coast of Maroochydore on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Some of you may have been there or even dived that particular site. I'm also going to be guilty, as Bill was, as reading directly from some of the data and information that's been provided by them, because I think it's very important that we're accurate in the information that we're presenting to you tonight. Data from several international sites suggest artificial reefs generate economic benefits and represent a significant economic opportunity that should not be underestimated. Although important for decision making, stakeholders directly associated with the conservation park in the Sunshine Coast identified that Australian-based economic data on artificial reefs was unavailable. That is, of course, until this particular study and report was released. Just to briefly give you an overview of the methodology that was used, and to address these issues and provide reliable data, data collection was undertaken over 12 consecutive months between March 2008 and February 2009, covering weekdays, weekends, public holidays and school holidays. Visitor expenditure information was collected from both local and tourist scuba divers, that is, those from outside the region, and they were taken whilst the divers were at the conservation park itself. They were direct one-on-one questionnaires whilst the divers were engaged in their experience. The study applied the direct expenditure method to measure economic value of the conservation park. DM is a quantitative technique that can be an effective predictor of the economic contribution of tourism in natural, artificial and modified environments. DEM includes calculating estimated total expenditure, attribution and substitution related expenditure, and expenditure categories assessment. The key results of that study are as follows. During the 12 months of data collection, permits were issued to 4,943 divers visiting the site with an authorised dive operator. So we're looking at about 5,000 divers annually at a minimum, and I'll explain to you why I've just used the comment there, at a minimum, a little bit later. Permits for divers visiting the park with an authorised dive operator totalled 4,475, with 894 of the divers, 18%, successfully surveyed. So the sample size is about 900 people. Satisfactory response rate was collected due to questionnaires being administered in a captive location. Of those 894 divers, 13% were residents of the Sunshine Coast, 13% were locals, 87% were from outside the region. 18% originated from overseas and from 20 different countries. The most common countries of origin were Germany, USA and New Zealand, which is commensurate with our experience of how those particular international markets engage in higher level activities. And this is a really important point, something particularly important for the people who stand to gain benefit and inject that benefit back into the local community. Only a small number of those tourist divers stayed for a single night, 11%. 12% of them stayed for 15 nights, and 26% stayed for 7 nights. Now, for those of you who are familiar with tourism, one of our key metrics that we measure is length of stay. And this is extraordinary given the typical tourist stays on the Sunshine Coast are about 2.5 nights. So divers to the region for the purpose of the site stayed a lot longer than those who would normally come for a normal holiday. As far as expenditure goes, the total expenditure by those 778 tourist divers was $680,000, with an average value of $870 per diver. In contrast, 116 local divers spent approximately $39,000, or $343 per diver. The total number of permits issued between August 2005 and the end of July 2009 on the Sunshine Coast was approximately 19,802. So by using the average spend and extrapolating that with the number of permits that have been collected, and I'm pleased to be able to put this to rest in this community, in this forum, because there has been speculation about the total economic expenditure associated with divers. The approximate total economic value for the conservation park relating directly to dive tourism was estimated over that period as $18,330,000. This represents an average of $4.5 million per year for the 4 years since the park began operating. $4.5 million annually into the local community of the Central Coast. There's also the multipliers and the diffusion of that spend. Tourist divers spent between 73% and 86% of their total expenditure within the hospitality sector. And as we know, hospitality businesses purchase goods and services from a multitude of other businesses locally, mainly. So the expenditure is clearly being moved throughout this and throughout the other regions. An important point to make here is that 1/3 of the divers surveyed came with a companion. It doesn't tell you how many companions, but they came with a companion, one or more. And given that 1/3 of those divers' companions and their economic expenditure has not been calculated, we can assume that the total value and the total economic value would be at least that $18 million figure over the 4 years. So there's quite a convincing case when it comes to the economic stimulation that a dive site can produce for local communities. There is, however, challenges, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this. There is evidence to suggest, as many would expect, that dive numbers to the site decrease over time. This is not uncommon for a lot of tourism attractions. It's not unique to the dive industry. Many attractions that start up have an initial period where there is excitement, high levels of PR, and high patronage following a launch. So in that way, the site itself is not unique. And that is the challenge of marketers such as myself and the community to ensure that the economic benefits associated with the dive site have longevity and are ongoing. To give you an example, overtime analysis reveals a decline in the diver numbers and their associated expenditure from about 4.6 million in 2005-06 to about 3.8 million. That's still $3.8 million of expenditure we do not currently have on the Central Coast. I strongly believe that the exHMAS Adelaide is better positioned than dive sites elsewhere across Australia, and I think we've got a better case that the economic benefits will follow because of the following factors. One is the weather. We've heard it being commented on in the public conversation that the Central Coast provides an ideal weather environment for the dive site. Open water destinations with marine environment amplify weather-related issues, and during the data collection, an average of 22% of days per month were adversely affected by poor weather conditions, reducing the number of possible dive trips. The experts tell me that the weather conditions on the Central Coast are far more protected than that on the Sunshine Coast, and therefore we can expect a higher or more frequent and better performance with respect to the days that the dive site is open for viewing. Adverse weather may account for the apparent decline in the diver numbers in this particular study. The second point is the accessibility of the Central Coast. The dive site will be located less than a 2-hour drive from Australia's major airport, being Sydney, and less than 1.5 hours from another major airport, being Newcastle. 2 ports, a larger potential pool of international and domestic tourists, in my view, therefore leads to greater likelihood of dive visitors. 3, the marketing strategy. I'm well aware that the efforts made on the Sunshine Coast took some time to get going. I think we've learned from some of those experiences, and dive operators on the Central Coast, in conjunction with Central Coast Tourism and Tourism New South Wales, are better prepared and will be more proactive in ongoing marketing efforts. The other factor is competitive positioning. Queensland experiences a high level of competition with its own backyard, that being the Great Barrier Reef, and the significant dive opportunities presented by that product. Given that this will be the hero product in New South Wales, there really is no substitute competitor, and therefore we could perhaps assume that there would also be a greater case for a larger market being attracted. The report makes of a number of final recommendations the following observation. The environmental condition of natural reefs is a growing concern. Global warming, climate change and pollution negatively affect and impact natural reefs. Artificial reefs could provide the best of both worlds, as an artificial site is literally transformed from a man-made object into a flourishing, dynamic ecosystem. The existence of an artificial reef may increase diver-related expenditure coming into a region while reducing visitation and thus damage to neighbouring natural reefs. Dive operators on the Sunshine Coast indicated the number of dives to the conservation park outnumber those to natural reefs. I think that's an important point. So I think from an economic point of view, the case is also made. We have a detailed study that is recent. It's been conducted by university scholars. It's employed a very well-respected methodology and approach using DEM. And the results and the impact on the local community of the Sunshine Coast speak for themselves, and I've just made an argument for why there's no reason why we wouldn't receive at least the experience of the Sunshine Coast, if not greater. Just quickly turning to the social implications of this particular process, if we go back to the triple bottom line reporting. It's my view that there is an opportunity that now presents, given that the Adelaide and the date of its scuttling has now been announced, but I won't steal Sue's thunder, that we have an opportunity to engage with those who very clearly have been upset with the process that's been engaged here. And I think it's critically important that we engage with those individuals and attempt at least to not only give them the opportunity to understand our point of view, but also give them the opportunity to be part of the future of this site. And I'd like to use a case study that perhaps makes the point better than I could just speaking to that. There was a major development in the northern part of Australia about 15 years ago that was vehemently opposed by the local community. Environmentalists, local green groups, passionately opposed this particular development. Many of you may have travelled there, and if you have recently, you'll understand what a delight this particular tourism product has become, and it is the Skyrail in Cairns. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Skyrail, what we're talking about is a huge gondola system that has been developed not just in any rainforest, but a World Heritage listed area. World Heritage listed by UNESCO. We're talking about 4 stations constructed within the World Heritage listed area, a cableway of 7.5 kilometres, 32 towers built in rainforest in total. The Skyrail, if you've been there, is an amazing achievement, given the fact that it was so vehemently opposed in its early days. The concept was conceived in 1987, and following 7 years of pre-construction feasibility, it finally got up. Many of the people who initially started as in opposition to that particular tourism development are proud owners of its future. And I'd like to read out to you some of the awards that Skyrail has now received in the tourism industry. At the regional level, 4 consecutive years Best Major Tourism Attraction, and in 2009, winner of the Sustainable Tourism category for Tourism Tropical North Queensland. At the Queensland tourism level, 4 consecutive years as Best Major Tourist Attraction, and in 2008 and 2009, Excellence in Sustainable Tourism. At the Australian National Qantas Tourism Awards level, 3 consecutive years as the Best Major Tourist Attraction, and 2008-2009 Excellence in Sustainable Tourism. And this is the real convincing item that I'd like to leave with you to think about. Internationally, Skyrail has taken out several awards. In 1996, it took out the European Greening of Business Tourism Awards in the category of Most Environmentally Conscious Visitor Attraction. In 1999, it won the Wet Tropics Management Authority Cassowary Award, awarded for demonstrating best practice in ecotourism during construction and ongoing operation, and for providing a high-quality rainforest ecotourism experience for hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. And in 2000, the British Airways Tourism for Tomorrow International Environment Award. I think the point I'm making here is that we have an opportunity, to ensure the future of this particular dive tourism site as becoming an example of how to work with tourism, to ensure sustainable practices are advocated and implemented, and to meet the needs of our local community, balancing the triple bottom line that we all look for. Thank you.